Ashamed of his wife, he took his mistress to the gala unaware his wife was the key speaker. He froze in shock. Jason Whitaker walked into the most important gala of the season with his mistress on his arm, cameras flashing, champagne flowing. Then the keynote speaker took the stage in a crimson gown and his entire world shattered in front of 500 witnesses. It was his wife, Danielle Monroe, the woman he'd spent years hiding and diminishing, now standing under a spotlight he never saw coming. What happened next didn't just destroy his reputation. It redefined what the world thought about power, betrayal, and the cost of underestimating the woman you vowed to love. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The wedding portraits hung in Jason Whitaker's office like monuments to a carefully constructed lie. Danielle's face glowed in every frame, her smile genuine, her posture elegant even then. Jason stood beside her in each photograph, his expression polished to perfection, his jaw set with the confidence of a man who believed he'd won. The business world had whispered that day about how Jason had married well. A beautiful, intelligent woman with impeccable connections and a future brighter than most could dream of. They didn't see how his hand had gripped her waist possessively during the reception, not lovingly. They didn't notice how his eyes had tracked every influential guest instead of meeting hers, calculating who was watching, who was impressed. They didn't hear him correct her pronunciation of a colleague's name in front of the crowd, his tone light but his message clear. She was still rough around the edges, still someone he needed to manage. Inside the Whitaker penthouse, partnership never took root. Jason treated marriage like a merger, one where he remained CEO and Danielle played the supporting role. She became the curator of his image, not the co-author of their life. Every morning she woke with purpose, preparing for her speeches, her meetings, her initiatives. She would pass through the kitchen where Jason sat with his laptop, already deep in deals and market reports. She'd greet him softly, mention her schedule, ask about his day. He barely looked up. His responses came in distracted hums and half nods, as though her voice were background noise rather than the sound of his wife. When she shared news of a keynote invitation or a successful fundraiser, he'd nod curtly and return to his screen, his congratulations thin and formulaic, as though she were a colleague reporting quarterly results instead of a partner sharing victories. Jason measured people by the attention they commanded in rooms that mattered. Danielle, with her composed demeanor and her preference for substance over spectacle, threatened him. He wanted flash, a woman dripping in designer labels and practice charm, someone who amplified his presence rather than eclipsed it. Danielle, with her quiet confidence and her speeches that moved senators to tears, didn't fit his script. She exceeded it. So he excluded her. Galas, networking dinners, industry celebrations. He attended alone or with colleagues. Never with her. She became invisible in her own marriage, a name on documents but absent from his world. One evening, as Danielle prepared for a nonprofit board meeting, she mentioned casually that she'd been asked to speak at the Chamber of Global Innovation Gala. Jason glanced up from his phone, eyes scanning her modest dress and minimal jewelry. He smirked faintly and muttered, "You'd probably bore them to death with all that earnest charity talk anyway." He didn't look at her face. He didn't see the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers stilled on her briefcase. He didn't hear the quiet breath she drew to steady herself. He swiped to the next email, and the silence between them crystallized. Cold, brittle, irreparable. But silence wasn't surrender. Inside Danielle Monroe, each dismissal forged something unbreakable. Every time Jason diminished her, she expanded. Every time he looked away, she sharpened her vision. She wasn't building a response to his cruelty. She was building an empire he'd never see coming. While Danielle constructed her legacy in boardrooms and on stages across continents, Jason Whitaker found his solace in something far more superficial. Something that reflected back exactly what he wanted to see. Her name was Sofia Delgado, and she entered Jason's life the way expensive things often do. Beautifully packaged, immediately gratifying, and ultimately hollow. He'd met her at a product launch for a tech startup his firm was backing. She'd been hired as a brand ambassador, one of those luminous women stationed near the champagne fountain, tasked with making conversations feel more exclusive than they were. Sofia wore a dress that looked poured onto her body, her laughter pitched perfectly to cut through ambient noise without seeming shrill. When Jason approached with his business card and practiced charm, she'd looked at him like he'd personally hung every chandelier in the venue. "You have such presence," she'd purred, her fingers grazing his wrist as she accepted his card. "I can always tell when someone actually matters." It was a line she'd delivered 1,000 times before. But Jason, starving for validation his wife no longer provided, swallowed it whole. Within weeks, Sofia became a fixture in the margins of his life. Lunch meetings that stretched long. Late-night texts disguised as networking. Hotel rooms booked under strategic pretenses. She was everything Danielle refused to be. Effortlessly admiring, vocally impressed, endlessly available. Where Danielle spoke of policy reform and systemic change, Sofia spoke of him. His intelligence. His style. His importance. She made him feel like the center of gravity in every room they occupied together. Jason told himself it wasn't love. He wasn't that foolish. But it was intoxicating in ways his marriage had never been. With Sofia, he didn't have to compete for air. He didn't have to watch his wife command rooms while he stood in her considerable shadow. With Sofia, he was the story. What Jason didn't know, what he never bothered to learn, was that Sofia Delgado had perfected this performance long before she met him. Born Sofia Reyes in a forgotten corner of Newark, she'd grown up watching her mother clean other people's homes while her father disappeared into bottles and excuses. By 15, Sofia understood that beauty was currency, and she possessed it in abundance. By 20, she'd changed her last name to something that sounded more cosmopolitan, learned to modulate her accent depending on her audience, and mastered the art of making powerful men feel powerful. She'd cycled through attachments before, a real estate mogul, a minor politician, a television producer who promised roles that never materialized. Each relationship followed the same trajectory. Initial infatuation, gradual realization of her partner's limitations, strategic exit before things turned messy. Sofia wasn't cruel, but she was practical. She knew men like Jason Whitaker collected women the way they collected watches. For status, for variety, for the temporary thrill of ownership. She also knew he'd never leave his wife. Men like Jason rarely did. The optics were too complicated. The financial entanglements too messy. But that didn't mean she couldn't enjoy the ride while it lasted. The expensive dinners, the spontaneous shopping trips, the hotel suites with room service and Egyptian cotton sheets. Sofia had learned to extract maximum value from minimum commitment. "You deserve better than being hidden," Jason told her one evening, his hand tracing the curve of her bare shoulder. They were tangled in overpriced bedding at the Windsor Hotel, his wedding ring discarded on the nightstand like loose change. Sofia smiled into the dim light, knowing exactly what he meant. He wanted to be seen with her. He wanted witnesses to his desirability. "Then stop hiding me," she whispered, her voice honeyed with manufactured vulnerability. "Show me off." The invitation to the Chamber of Global Innovation Gala arrived 3 days later, embossed in gold, heavy with prestige. Jason barely glanced at the keynote lineup. His eyes went straight to the guest list. Senators, media executives, Fortune 500 CEOs. The kind of crowd that could elevate or destroy a reputation in a single evening. He didn't ask Danielle if she'd be attending. He didn't think to check. His wife's schedule had become white noise to him, something that existed in parallel to his life rather than intersecting with it. When Danielle mentioned a scheduling conflict that week, Jason assumed her absence was confirmed. He saw opportunity. For the next 2 weeks, Jason orchestrated his gala appearance with military precision. He booked appointments at the city's most exclusive tailor, selecting a custom tuxedo in midnight blue with satin lapels that caught light like oil on water. He arranged for Sophia's dress to be designed specifically for the occasion, a champagne-colored gown with a thigh-high slit and a back that plunged dramatically, the kind of garment engineered to stop conversations mid-sentence. He coordinated their arrival time to maximize visibility. Not too early to seem desperate, not too late to miss the prime networking window. He mentally rehearsed introductions, prepared talking points about his firm's latest acquisitions, even practiced the casual way he'd rest his hand on Sophia's lower back. Proprietary but not crude, confident but not arrogant. Sophia went along with every detail, her enthusiasm seemingly genuine. She attended fittings, offered opinions on cufflinks, practiced her most photogenic angles. Inside, she felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with detachment. This would be her highest profile appearance yet. The photographs alone would elevate her social media value considerably. And after Jason inevitably returned to his predictable life, she'd have the images, the connections, and the stories. The night before the gala, Jason stood in his walk-in closet, adjusting his bow tie in the three-way mirror. Behind him, his wedding photo with Danielle hung on the wall, a detail he no longer noticed. In the reflection, he saw exactly what he wanted to see: a man reclaiming his narrative, about to make an entrance that would remind everyone who Jason Whitaker really was. He smiled at his reflection, straightening his shoulders. Tomorrow night, he thought, would finally be his moment to shine. He had no idea how catastrophically right and wrong he was. Before Danielle Monroe became a name that commanded standing ovations, before she addressed parliaments and moved philanthropists to open their checkbooks, before she became the woman Jason Whitaker tried desperately to diminish, she was simply Danielle, a girl from Cleveland with second-hand textbooks and impossible dreams. She'd grown up in a modest duplex where dinner conversations revolved around making ends meet, not making connections. Her father worked double shifts at the automotive plant. Her mother cleaned houses during the day and took online courses at night, determined to finish the degree she'd abandoned when Danielle was born. They didn't have wealth or pedigree, but they gave their daughter something more valuable: the unshakable belief that she could build whatever life she imagined. At 17, Danielle won a scholarship to Georgetown. Not because someone handed her opportunities, but because she'd studied until her eyes burned, volunteered until her feet ached, and written application essays that made admissions officers weep. She arrived on campus with 2 suitcases and a hunger that privileged classmates couldn't comprehend. The hunger of someone who understood that education wasn't an expectation but a lifeline. She majored in international relations, minored in economics, and spent her summers interning at non-profits that couldn't afford to pay her. While other students island hopped through Europe on their parents' credit cards, Danielle mapped out her future with the precision of an architect designing a cathedral. Every connection she made was strategic. Every skill she acquired was intentional. She didn't have the luxury of wandering. She had to build. By 25, she'd landed a position at the Global Wellness Initiative, a nonprofit focused on healthcare access in underserved communities. By 27, she'd authored a policy brief that caught the attention of 3 senators and a UN committee. By 29, she was being invited to speak at conferences where she was often the youngest and only woman at the table. That's where she met Jason Whitaker. He'd attended one of her panel discussions on sustainable development funding. After the session, he'd approached with champagne and compliments, his smile engineered to disarm. He told her she was brilliant. He told her she was captivating. He told her he'd never met anyone quite like her. What he didn't tell her What she wouldn't discover until much later was that he'd already decided she would look perfect in his origin story. The self-made woman. The intelligent wife. The kind of partner who elevated a man's resume without threatening his spotlight. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of romantic dinners and carefully orchestrated public appearances. Jason presented himself as her champion, her supporter, her biggest fan. He attended her speaking engagements, applauded enthusiastically, introduced her to his network with obvious pride. Danielle, who'd spent years focused solely on her mission, found herself swept up in something that felt like partnership. The cracks didn't appear until after the wedding. It started small. Jason suggesting she skip a conference because he had a client dinner the same weekend. Wouldn't it be nice to spend time together? Then it was the subtle editing of her anecdotes at parties, the way he'd interrupt her mid-story to clarify or add context. The dinners where he'd check his phone while she spoke about her work, his attention drifting as though her words held no weight. One evening, 6 months into their marriage, Danielle received notification that she'd been selected as a keynote speaker for the Women in Leadership Summit, a career-defining moment. She'd rushed home early, excitement bubbling in her chest, eager to share the news. Jason had been in his study, reviewing contracts. She'd knocked softly, entered with a smile bright enough to light the dim room. "Jason, I have incredible news." "Can it wait?" He hadn't looked up. "I'm in the middle of something important." She'd stood there, invitation letter clutched in her hand, watching him highlight paragraphs and make margin notes. After 5 minutes of silence, she'd quietly retreated. He never asked about her news. She never told him. The pattern repeated itself in countless variations. The conference where he forgot to attend her keynote. The fundraising gala where he introduced her as "my wife Danielle," without mentioning she'd organized the entire event. The dinner party where he'd actually laughed, when someone asked if she worked, saying, "She keeps busy with charity stuff." Charity stuff. As if she hadn't built programs that provided clean water to 50,000 people. As if her policy recommendations hadn't influenced legislation in 7 countries. As if her busy work hadn't earned her recognition from organizations Jason couldn't name, let alone access. But Danielle Monroe didn't crumble under dismissal. She transmuted it. Every time Jason minimized her achievements, she expanded her reach. Every event he excluded her from, she booked 2 more speaking engagements. Every dinner where he made her feel invisible, she stayed up afterward revising speeches, crafting proposals, building networks that had nothing to do with being someone's wife and everything to do with being herself. She stopped seeking his validation. She stopped sharing her victories. She stopped expecting him to see her. Instead, she became undeniable to everyone else. The world outside her marriage began to recognize what Jason refused to acknowledge. Invitations flooded her inbox. Keynotes, panels, advisory board positions. Journalists requested interviews. Organizations competed for her endorsement. Danielle Monroe, the name, started to carry weight that had nothing to do with being Mrs. Whitaker. And through it all, she maintained her composure. She didn't complain to friends. Didn't post cryptic social media messages. Didn't stage dramatic confrontations. Danielle understood something Jason never would. Real power didn't announce itself with noise. It simply existed, undeniable and absolute. 3 weeks before the Chamber of Global Innovation Gala, Danielle received the call. They wanted her to deliver the keynote address. The theme, Integrity in the Age of Optics. She'd accepted immediately. Then she'd hung up the phone and sat very still in her home office, the one Jason rarely entered, surrounded by awards he'd never commented on and photographs from events he'd never attended. She didn't tell him about the speech. Didn't mention she'd be there. Didn't ask if he planned to attend. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even strategy. It was simply the truth of their marriage finally rendered visible. She'd been moving in worlds he couldn't see, building something he couldn't touch, becoming someone he'd never truly known. Danielle confirmed her attendance with the event coordinator, approved the promotional materials with her name and photograph, and went about her week as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The chess piece had been moved. The trap had been set. All that remained was for Jason Whitaker to walk into the room and finally see what he'd been too blind to notice all along. His wife had become far more than he'd ever imagined, and far more than he deserved. The grand celestial ballroom transformed itself into a cathedral of ambition every year for the Chamber of Global Innovation Gala, and tonight was no exception. Crystal chandeliers descended from vaulted ceilings like frozen constellations, each one shedding enough light to make diamonds weep with envy. The marble floors gleamed mirror-bright, reflecting the careful choreography of wealth and influence as guests glided across its surface in designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. Jason Whitaker arrived at precisely 8:17, fashionably late enough to make an entrance, punctual enough to catch the prime networking hour. Sofia Delgado clung to his arm like a perfectly placed accessory, her champagne gown catching every flash of light, every camera angle, every envious glance. Or so Jason believed. The moment they crossed the threshold, cameras erupted in cascades of white light. Jason straightened his shoulders, his smile broadening with practiced ease. This was it. This was his moment. Sofia beside him radiated the kind of beauty that didn't whisper. It announced. Her gown's thigh-high slit revealed legs that seemed engineered by mathematics rather than genetics. Her back, bare almost to indecency, showcased skin that glowed under the chandeliers like burnished gold. Mr. Whitaker. A photographer gestured them toward the step and repeat banner emblazoned with corporate logos. Over here, please. Jason positioned himself with Sofia, his hand settling possessively on her lower back. The cameras clicked. He imagined tomorrow's society pages, the social media posts, the whispered conversations at Monday morning meetings. Did you see Whitaker at the gala? That woman with him was absolutely stunning. What Jason didn't notice, what his ego wouldn't allow him to register, was the quality of the stairs following them into the ballroom. A cluster of executives near the champagne fountain paused mid-conversation, their eyes tracking Jason's progression through the crowd. One woman, a CEO Jason had tried unsuccessfully to pitch 3 months prior, leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand. Both pairs of eyes flickered from Jason to Sofia, then away quickly, as though they'd witnessed something simultaneously fascinating and uncomfortable. At the bar, 2 journalists exchanged glances laden with meaning. One pulled out her phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. The other smirked, shaking her head slowly. Near the hors d'oeuvres table, a Senator Jason had met twice before caught his eye. The man's expression wasn't admiring. It was something closer to second-hand embarrassment. He raised his champagne glass in a gesture that could have been a greeting or a warning, then turned deliberately away. But Jason saw none of this. He saw only what he wanted to see: the turning heads, the camera flashes, the obvious attention. He'd been invisible for too long in Danielle's shadow. Tonight, finally, he was the sun. "You look like you're glowing," Sofia purred into his ear, her fingers tracing the lapel of his midnight blue tuxedo. "Everyone's watching us." "They are, aren't they?" Jason accepted 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter, handing one to Sofia with a smile that suggested he'd personally ordered the stars into alignment for this evening. They circulated through the ballroom like royalty touring their kingdom. Jason introduced Sofia to colleagues with studied casualness. "This is Sofia Delgado, a consultant I work with." The lie came smoothly, practiced during their taxi ride. Sofia played her part perfectly, laughing at appropriate moments, her hand never leaving his arm, her body language broadcasting exactly what consultant actually meant. More murmurs followed in their wake. More glances. More whispered exchanges behind raised champagne flutes. A woman Jason vaguely recognized from the non-profit sector approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Jason, good to see you. Is Danielle here tonight?" The question landed like a stone in still water. "She had other commitments," Jason replied smoothly, his hand tightening imperceptibly on Sophia's waist. "Scheduling conflict." "I see." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping to congratulate her in person." She walked away before Jason could ask what she meant. Sophia leaned closer, her perfume, something expensive and deliberately provocative, filling the space between them. "Who's Danielle?" "No one important," Jason murmured, his attention already shifting to a group of investment bankers near the orchestra platform. "Just someone from my past." The ballroom continued to fill. The air grew thick with cologne, perfume, and the particular electricity that came from too many ambitious people confined in one gilded space. Conversations rose and fell like waves. Ice clinked against crystal. Laughter erupted in strategic bursts, loud enough to seem genuine, calculated enough to draw attention. Throughout it all, Jason basked in what he perceived as admiration, oblivious to the undercurrent of anticipation threading through the crowd. People weren't staring at him with envy. They were staring with knowledge, the kind that made them check their watches, glance toward the stage, exchange loaded looks with fellow attendees who also knew what was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced over the sound system, crisp and official. "If you could begin making your way to your tables, tonight's program will commence shortly." The lights dimmed by degrees, transforming the ballroom from blazing cathedral to intimate theater. Conversations lowered to murmurs. Guests migrated toward assigned tables draped in ivory linens and crowned with centerpieces that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Jason guided Sophia to a table near the center. Not front row, but close enough to matter. She settled into her chair with practiced grace, crossing her legs in a way that made the gown's slit fall open like a promise. "This is incredible," she whispered, her eyes scanning the room with barely concealed calculation. Already, she was counting followers gained, opportunities earned, photographs that would live forever on the internet. Jason surveyed the room with satisfaction. The stage stood empty, spotlit and waiting. He had no idea who the keynote speaker was. Hadn't bothered to check. It didn't matter. He'd accomplished what he came here to do. Be seen, be envied, be remembered. The lights dimmed further. A hush fell over the ballroom like silk sliding off skin. And in that pregnant silence, in that moment before everything changed, Jason Whitaker smiled at Sofia Delgado and whispered, "Aren't you glad you came?" She smiled back, radiant and unknowing. Neither of them saw the figure moving through the shadows backstage. Neither heard the rustle of crimson fabric. Neither noticed the way certain members of the audience shifted forward in their seats, anticipation tightening their expressions. The lights went down completely. The spotlight warmed to life. And the night Jason had orchestrated so carefully began its irrevocable transformation into his unmaking. The spotlight ignited like a controlled explosion, bathing the stage in gold. And then she appeared. No fanfare. No introduction. No building crescendo of anticipation. Danielle Monroe simply walked onto the stage as though she'd been standing there all along, waiting for the world to finally notice what had always been true. The crimson gown moved with her like liquid fire, off-shoulder, elegant, devastating in its simplicity. No excessive embellishment. No desperate glitter. Just the kind of beauty that didn't beg for attention because it commanded it inherently. Her hair was swept back, revealing a face that had graced magazine covers and conference brochures, a face Jason had stopped truly seeing years ago. She carried a microphone in one hand. Her other hand hung loose at her side, relaxed, certain. The room recognized her before Jason did. A collective intake of breath rippled through the ballroom like wind through wheat. Heads turned. Spines straightened. The murmuring died so completely that the silence became its own sound. Vast, expectant, alive. Jason felt it before he saw it. The shift in atmospheric pressure. The subtle pivoting of bodies away from their tables and toward the stage. Sophia's fingers, which had been tracing idle patterns on his forearm, suddenly stilled. Froze. Her champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Jason. Her voice barely reached him, thin with confusion. And then he looked up. Time didn't just slow. It shattered. Every fragment of the moment crystallized with brutal clarity. The way Danielle's gown caught the light. The confidence in her shoulders. The microphone resting comfortably in her hand as though it had been designed specifically for her grip. The spotlight painting her in gold while the rest of the ballroom receded into shadow. Jason's throat closed. His lungs forgot their function. His heart performed some violent acrobatic feat inside his chest. Lurching, stopping, restarting in erratic rhythm. No. The word screamed silently through his mind, but no sound emerged. No. This isn't possible. She said she had a scheduling conflict. She said. But Danielle Monroe wasn't explaining herself. She was standing center stage at the most prestigious gala of the season, and the entire room was rotating its orbit around her. Jason, who'd spent the evening convinced he was the sun, felt himself suddenly, violently demoted to irrelevance. Sophia's hand tightened on his arm, no longer seductive but gripping, steadying herself as realization cut through her champagne-softened awareness. Is that? She didn't finish the question. She didn't need to. Around them the whispers began. Not loud. Not obvious. But unmistakable. That's his wife. Oh God, he brought his mistress. Did he not know she was speaking? This is going to be. Sure, she's about to start. Jason couldn't move. Couldn't think. His entire body had become an exhibit in paralysis. His carefully constructed entrance, his orchestrated appearance, his moment of triumph. All of it evaporated like champagne bubbles against the reality of his wife standing in a spotlight he hadn't known she'd earned. Danielle lifted the microphone. The room held its breath. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made shouting unnecessary. Clear. Resonant. The voice of someone who'd learned to fill spaces without ever raising her volume. Good evening. Thank you for that warm reception. She paused, her eyes sweeping the ballroom with practiced ease. They passed over Jason's table without stopping, without acknowledgement, as though he were simply another face in a sea of hundreds. Tonight I want to talk about integrity. Specifically, integrity in the age of optics. The title landed like a stone in Jason's stomach. We live in an era obsessed with appearances, Danielle continued, her tone conversational but weighted with meaning. We curate images. We craft narratives. We build versions of ourselves designed to impress, to intimidate, to inspire envy. Social media has made us all performers on a stage we never leave. Sophia shifted in her seat. Several people at nearby tables glanced toward Jason's table, then quickly away. But there's a profound difference between building an image and building a life. Danielle's words fell like measured cuts, precise and surgical. An image can be manufactured overnight. A life requires years of quiet, unglamorous work that no one photographs. No one applauds. No one even notices, until it becomes undeniable. Jason felt his face burning despite the ballroom's careful climate control. Sweat gathered at his collar. Some people mistake visibility for value, Danielle said, her gaze moving across the audience with the confidence of someone who knew every eye was tracking her movement. They measure worth in camera flashes and Instagram followers. They believe if something isn't witnessed, it doesn't exist. If someone isn't watching, the effort doesn't count. Every sentence felt aimed directly at Jason's chest, even though Danielle hadn't looked at him once. She didn't need to. Her words painted a portrait so precise, so damning, that half the room was undoubtedly thinking of someone they knew. Jason just happened to be sitting center stage for his own unintended exhibition. But integrity, Danielle's voice softened, became almost intimate despite the microphone and the hundreds of listeners. Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. It's the foundation you build in private that determines whether you'll stand or crumble when the spotlight inevitably finds you. Sophia's leg began bouncing nervously beneath the table. She'd stopped touching Jason, put distance between them without actually moving. The air between them grew thick with unspoken understanding. This wasn't the evening either of them had anticipated. "I've spent 15 years working in spaces most people will never see," Danielle continued, her composure absolute. "Villages without cameras. Meetings without press releases. Moments of real change that would never trend on social media. And I learned something crucial. The work that matters most often happens in silence. The people worth becoming don't announce themselves. They simply are undeniable, unshakable, real." The ballroom remained frozen. No one coughed. No one checked their phones. Danielle Monroe commanded the kind of attention Jason had desperately sought and never achieved. The attention earned through substance rather than spectacle. Jason's hands gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles blanched white. He wanted to leave, to disappear, to somehow reverse the last 10 minutes and rewrite this evening into something that didn't feel like public execution. But moving would draw more attention. Staying meant enduring every word, every implication, every carefully crafted blade disguised as inspiration. "So tonight," Danielle said, her voice rising slightly, building toward conclusion, "I want to challenge each of you to ask yourselves, what are you building when no one's watching? Who are you becoming in the quiet moments between performances? Because eventually, inevitably, the performance ends. The cameras stop flashing. The applause fades. And all that remains is the truth of who you actually are." She paused. The silence expanded. Make sure that truth is worth revealing. The ballroom erupted. Applause thundered through the space like a physical force. People rose to their feet. First one, then 10, then 100, until the entire ballroom stood in ovation. The sound crashed over Jason in waves, drowning him, suffocating him with the recognition he'd craved but directed entirely at someone else. At his wife. The wife he'd hidden. The wife he'd diminished. The wife who now stood in a crimson gown, bathed in gold, receiving the kind of adoration he'd spent years chasing and never caught. Danielle Monroe accepted the applause with a gracious nod, her smile warm but controlled. Professional. Perfect. And when her eyes finally, found Jason across the sea of standing guests, she didn't flinch, didn't falter. She simply held his gaze with an expression so calm, so absolutely devastating in its composure, that Jason understood with crystal clarity. She'd known. She'd known he'd be here. Known he'd bring Sophia. Known exactly what this moment would cost him. And she'd walked onto that stage anyway. Not as revenge, but as revelation. The standing ovation continued long after protocol demanded. Wave after wave of applause crashed against the walls of the grand celestial ballroom, each surge more enthusiastic than the last. Danielle Monroe stood in the spotlight, accepting the adoration with the grace of someone who'd earned every decibel, every raised hand, every admiring gaze. She didn't bow, didn't perform false modesty. She simply nodded, smiled with genuine warmth, and descended the stage as though walking through her own living room. Comfortable, unhurried, certain. The crowd swarmed her immediately. Executives parted from their tables like the Red Sea responding to divine command. A senator reached her first, clasping both her hands with enthusiasm usually reserved for campaign donors. A tech CEO waited his turn, already pulling out his phone to schedule a meeting. Journalists materialized from the periphery, notebooks ready, questions forming. Danielle moved through the attention like water. Fluid, natural, absorbing it without drowning in it. She shook hands, accepted compliments with gracious thank yous, and managed to make each interaction feel personal despite the crush of bodies vying for her acknowledgement. At his table, Jason remained frozen. His hands still gripped the edge of the tablecloth. His champagne sat untouched, the bubbles long dead. Sophia extracted her arm from his with surgical precision. The movement was subtle but definitive, a clear punctuation mark ending whatever sentence they'd been writing together. Jason. Her voice had lost all its honey. What remained was something harder, more calculating. Did you know? He couldn't form words. His throat had become a desert. Did you know she'd be here? Sophia's eyes, which had gazed at him with manufactured adoration just 20 minutes ago, now assessed him with the cool detachment of an accountant reviewing bad investments. Jason's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. She said she had a conflict. She didn't tell me. She didn't tell you. Sophia's laugh was sharp, mirthless. Or you didn't ask. Around them, conversations resumed in hushed tones. But Jason could feel the weight of peripheral attention, the glances that landed on their table like birds of prey circling carrion. People weren't staring directly, but he could feel their awareness, their whispered assessments, their barely concealed fascination with the drama unfolding in real time. Sophia, listen. Jason reached for her hand. She pulled away as though his touch burned. Don't. The single word carried more venom than any paragraph could. I'm not stupid, Jason. I know exactly what just happened. Nothing happened. This is just what? A coincidence. Sophia's perfectly painted lips curved into something too bitter to be called a smile. You brought me here to parade me around like some kind of trophy while your wife, your incredibly accomplished, internationally recognized wife, was the keynote speaker? Do you have any idea how this looks? Jason's mind scrambled for purchase, for some explanation that could reframe the catastrophe unfolding around him. I didn't know. You have to believe me. This is just bad timing. Bad timing. Sophia stood, her chair scraping against marble with a sound that drew more eyes. Bad timing is traffic. Bad timing is a scheduling conflict. This. She gestured vaguely toward the stage, toward the crowd still clustered around Danielle. This is a humiliation. And I refuse to be part of it. Sophia, please. But she was already gathering her clutch, her phone, her dignity. I should thank you, actually. This will make an incredible story someday. The night I learned to never settle for being someone's dirty secret. She walked away without looking back, her champagne gown catching light as she wove through tables toward the exit. Several heads turned to track her departure. More whispers erupted in her wake. Jason sat alone at a table set for two, surrounded by hundreds of people, drowning in isolation. He needed to do something. Fix this. Control the narrative. Salvage whatever remained of his dignity. He stood on unsteady legs, his vision tunneling as adrenaline and humiliation waged war in his bloodstream. Across the ballroom, through the crowd, his eyes found Danielle. She'd moved near the bar area, still surrounded but slightly less mobbed. A woman in an emerald gown was speaking enthusiastically, gesturing with her champagne glass. Danielle listened with genuine attention, nodding, responding with what appeared to be thoughtful engagement. And then, as though she'd felt his stare, she looked up. Their eyes met across the expanse of marble and ambition. Jason expected anger, accusation, some visible sign of the betrayal she must have felt discovering him here with Sophia. He braced himself for tears, for fury, for dramatic confrontation. Instead, Danielle's expression held nothing but calm. An absolute terrifying calm that spoke louder than any outburst could. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't soften, didn't harden. She simply looked at him with the detachment of someone observing a stranger in passing. Someone who'd already moved beyond whatever had once connected them. It was the look of a woman who'd already decided. Not in anger. Not in pain. In certainty. Jason's feet began moving before his brain approved the action. He needed to talk to her. Explain. Apologize. Something. Anything to bridge the canyon that had opened between them in the span of one 20-minute speech. He'd barely made it 3 steps when a young woman in a press badge materialized in his path. Mr. Whitaker. She held a phone in recorder mode, her smile professional but her eyes glittering with the hunger of someone who'd stumbled onto a story. Amanda Chen, Metropolitan Observer. Could I have a moment? This isn't a good time, Jason tried to sidestep. She mirrored his movement with practiced ease. I'll be quick. That was quite a powerful speech from Mrs. Monroe. Were you aware she'd be speaking tonight? The question landed like a punch to his solar plexus. Yes. Of course. The lie came automatically, desperately. Amanda's eyebrow arched slightly. Interesting. Because several guests mentioned you seemed surprised when she took the stage. And I couldn't help but notice. Her eyes flickered past Jason to where Sophia had stood minutes ago. You weren't seated in the spouse section. You were at a table with another woman who's just left looking quite upset. Jason's face burned. His collar felt like a noose. That was a colleague. A business associate. A business associate wearing a date dress to a gala where your wife was the keynote? Amanda's tone remained pleasant, conversational, as though she were asking about the weather rather than excavating his humiliation with surgical precision. Mr. Whitaker, there are already photographs circulating on social media. You arriving with your colleague. Mrs. Monroe delivering what's already being called one of the most powerful speeches of the year. Some are calling it the most elegant public response to infidelity they've ever witnessed. The word hung in the air between them like poison gas. That's ridiculous, Jason managed, though his voice lacked conviction. This is all a misunderstanding. So you're denying. I'm not denying anything because there's nothing to deny. Jason's voice rose slightly, drawing more attention. He forced himself to lower it, to regain some semblance of control. Now, if you'll excuse me. He pushed past her, his only thought to reach Danielle, to somehow contain this before it metastasized into something he couldn't manage. But when he looked back toward the bar, Danielle was gone. Only the crowd remained, their conversations humming with barely suppressed excitement, their phones out, their attention split between their screens and the real-life drama unfolding in their midst. Jason stood in the center of the ballroom, the same ballroom where he'd arrived 2 hours ago convinced he was about to shine, and felt his carefully constructed world crumbling into ash around him. The cameras that had captured his entrance were still recording. Only now, they were documenting his destruction. Jason woke to the sound of his phone vibrating against the nightstand like a trapped insect dying slowly. He'd fallen asleep in his tuxedo, bow tie discarded somewhere between the bedroom door and the bed, shoes still on, the taste of failure coating his tongue. The vibrating didn't stop. He reached for the phone with the dread of someone opening a letter they knew contained devastating news. The screen blazed to life, notification after notification cascading down like an avalanche. 47 missed calls. 183 text messages. 2,847 new emails. His social media accounts had been tagged so many times the numbers had stopped making sense. His thumb hovered over the screen, paralyzed by the certainty that opening any of these messages would make the nightmare real in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He opened Twitter first. Mistake. The first post showed a split image. Jason and Sophia entering the gala on the left, both glittering and smug. On the right, Danielle at the podium, radiant and powerful mid-speech. The caption read, "While he brought his mistress to play dress-up, she was busy being a whole movement. This is what we call levels." 847K likes. 312K retweets. 98K comments. Jason's stomach lurched. He scrolled. Another post, a screenshot of his face during Danielle's speech, captured by someone's phone camera. His expression was frozen in a rictus of horror, champagne glass suspended mid-air, every emotion, shock, humiliation, panic, painted across his features in high definition. POV, you just realized you fumbled a queen. 1.2M likes. The hashtags were already trending. Hashtag Galagate. Hashtag integrity in the age of optics. Hashtag Danielle Monroe. Hashtag know your worth. Someone had created a side-by-side comparison of Jason's arrival photos with screenshots from Danielle's speech, set to dramatic music. The video had 4.3 million views in 8 hours. A think piece from a major outlet. Danielle Monroe's masterclass in Grace Under Fire. What last night's viral moment teaches us about power, dignity, and public humiliation. A relationship podcast had already released an emergency episode, When Your Wife's Success Exposes Your Insecurity, unpacking the Jason Whitaker situation. A meme account had photoshopped Jason's shocked face onto various historical disasters. The Hindenburg, the Titanic, the Fire Festival. Jason's hands trembled. He kept scrolling, unable to stop, each post a fresh laceration. A celebrity he'd never met tweeted, "Men will really bring their side piece to an event and not even Google who's speaking. The audacity. The caucasity. The stupidity." 2.1M likes. Fashion accounts analyzed Danielle's crimson gown. Business magazines dissected her speech. Leadership coaches quoted her words in inspirational posts. Graduate programs in public relations were already using the incident as a case study in crisis management. Specifically, how Danielle had executed the perfect response without saying a word about the actual betrayal. And Sophia Delgado had posted once, hours after leaving the gala. A single image, herself in the champagne gown alone, with a caption that read, "Sometimes the trash takes itself out. Learned a valuable lesson about knowing your worth tonight." Hashtag never again, hashtag lesson learned. She'd untagged Jason from every previous post. Deleted photos. Erased him from her digital history as though he'd been a virus she'd successfully quarantined and eliminated. By the time the sun fully rose over the city, Jason's firm had issued a statement. Whitaker and Associates is aware of recent events involving one of our partners. We are conducting an internal review and have placed Mr. Jason Whitaker on indefinite administrative leave pending investigation. Our firm maintains the highest standards of professional conduct and personal integrity. The message was clear. Jason had become a liability. His phone rang. His managing partner. Jason answered with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. "Jason." The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, cold. "I'm going to be direct. 3 clients called this morning. They're pulling their accounts. 2 more are reconsidering the relationship. The optics." "The optics," Jason repeated numbly, "are catastrophic. You've become a PR nightmare. The board met an hour ago. The leave isn't temporary, Jason. We're discussing severance packages." The call ended before Jason could respond. Another call. Another client. Then another. Each conversation followed the same trajectory. Uncomfortable small talk, vague mentions of recent developments, and carefully worded exits that all translated to the same message. We can't be associated with you anymore. Jason turned on the television. Morning news shows were discussing it. Not leading with it. He wasn't important enough for that. But it was there, nestled between political scandals and celebrity gossip. A brief segment showing clips from Danielle's speech, a mention of the viral moment, a comment from the anchor about the power of grace under pressure. His phone buzzed again. A text from his brother. Dude, what the hell were you thinking? His mother. Jason, please call me. I've been seeing things online. Is it true? How could you do this to Danielle? Friends, or people he'd thought were friends, suddenly silent. No calls of support. No messages of solidarity. Just the deafening absence of anyone willing to stand beside a man who'd become a cautionary tale overnight. And Danielle? Danielle Monroe was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She'd been booked on 3 major morning shows. A late-night host wanted her. Podcasts were begging for interviews. Harvard Business Review wanted to profile her leadership style. A publishing house had reached out about a book deal. But she said nothing about Jason. Nothing about the betrayal. Nothing about the gala. When interviewers gently probed, that moment at the gala has really resonated with people. Do you want to address it? She smiled with practiced grace and pivoted. I'm here to talk about the work, she'd said on one show, her composure absolute. The work that happens in communities most people never see. That's what deserves attention, not one evening's drama. Her refusal to engage became its own message. Her silence screamed louder than any tell-all interview could. She didn't need to destroy Jason publicly. He'd already done that himself. All she had to do was continue being exactly who she'd always been. Brilliant, composed, untouchable. The contrast was devastating. While Danielle's star ascended, booked, quoted, celebrated, Jason's world contracted. He stopped opening his curtains. The penthouse that had once felt like a monument to his success now felt like a mausoleum. He walked through rooms filled with furniture that suddenly seemed like props in a play that had ended without him noticing. The wedding photos he'd ignored for years now accused him from their frames. He turned them face down, unable to meet Danielle's eyes even in photographs. Mirrors became enemies. Every time Jason caught his reflection, in windows, in the darkened television screen, in the bathroom mirror he couldn't avoid, he saw a stranger. A man who'd gambled everything on ego and lost. A man who'd had something real and rare and destroyed it for something shiny and shallow and temporary. The internet had christened him with titles he'd never escape. The Gala guy. That husband. The man who fumbled the queen. His name had become synonymous with hubris, with blindness, with the particular flavor of masculine insecurity that led men to destroy what they couldn't control. And the worst part, the part that kept Jason awake in the dark hours before dawn, was that none of it was exaggerated. None of it was unfair. The internet hadn't created a monster. It had simply held up a mirror and forced him to see what Danielle had been looking at for years. A man so threatened by his wife's light that he'd tried to extinguish it. And in doing so, had only managed to set himself on fire. Danielle Monroe stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her hotel suite, watching the city wake beneath a sky painted in shades of amber and rose. She'd checked into the Meridian 2 days after the gala, not fleeing, but creating necessary distance from a home that had stopped feeling like sanctuary years ago. The view stretched for miles. Buildings climbed toward heaven. Traffic flowed in organized chaos. Millions of lives unfolding in parallel, each person carrying their own victories and failures, their own moments of becoming. She'd barely slept since that night. Not from anguish. She'd shed those tears years ago, privately, in hotel bathrooms between conference sessions and in the quiet minutes before dawn when the world was too still to distract her from the loneliness of her marriage. No, she'd lain awake processing something far more complex than heartbreak. Liberation. The moment she'd seen Jason in that ballroom, Sophia glittering beside him like a purchased accessory, his face arranged in that familiar expression of self-satisfied importance, something inside Danielle had simply released, like a fist that had been clenched for years finally opening. All the effort she'd expended trying to be seen by him, trying to matter to him, trying to fit herself into the shape he wanted, it evaporated. Because standing on that stage, microphone in hand, receiving recognition from people who actually understood the work she'd done, Danielle had recognized a fundamental truth. Jason's inability to see her had never been about her inadequacy. It had been about his. She'd married a man who measured worth in applause and appearances. A man who needed to be the most impressive person in every room, even if it meant dimming everyone around him. Especially if it meant dimming her. But you couldn't dim what had its own power source. Danielle had spent 15 years building something real. Not an image, but a foundation. Programs that changed lives. Policies that moved systems. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than strategic networking. She'd done it all while Jason critiqued her clothes, minimized her accomplishments, and ultimately sought validation in the arms of someone who would never challenge him to be better. The betrayal hurt. Of course it did. But not in the way Jason might have imagined. It hurt the way truth hurts. Sharp, clarifying, ultimately necessary. Her phone buzzed with another interview request. She'd received hundreds since the gala. Everyone wanted her story, her reaction, her feelings about the moment that broke the internet. She'd declined them all. Until now. The podcast was called Elevation, a platform known for thoughtful conversations about growth, resilience, and transformation. The host, Maya Santos, had promised no ambush questions, no tabloid angles, just space for Danielle to speak about her work and, if she chose, her perspective on recent events. Danielle had agreed. They conducted the interview via video call from her hotel suite. Maya's face appeared on screen. Warm, intelligent, genuinely interested. Danielle Monroe, thank you so much for joining me. I know the last few weeks have been extraordinary. Danielle smiled, the expression genuine. That's a diplomatic word for it. Let's start with what I think everyone is really wondering. And you don't have to answer if you're not ready. But how are you? Really? Danielle paused, considering. When she spoke, her voice carried the clarity of someone who'd spent significant time in reflection. I'm stronger than I was. Does that surprise people? I think there's this expectation that I should be devastated or vengeful or performing some public breakdown. But honestly, Maya, I'm at peace. At peace with betrayal. At peace with truth. Danielle leaned forward slightly. For years, I was in a marriage where I was constantly trying to prove my worth to someone who'd decided I didn't have any. That's exhausting. Soul-crushing, actually. And when that moment happened, when he walked in with someone else and I was on that stage, it wasn't just exposure of his infidelity. It was exposure of a dynamic I'd been living with privately for years. The dynamic being that he was ashamed of me. Danielle said it simply, without bitterness. Ashamed of my success, my visibility, the fact that I didn't need him to validate my existence. Some men can't handle being partnered with women who don't need saving or managing or constant direction. Maya nodded slowly. And now I'm free to be exactly who I've always been. Without apology. Without diminishment. Danielle's expression softened. I've spent 15 years building programs that provide healthcare to underserved communities, creating educational initiatives, advocating for policy changes that actually save lives. That work didn't start because of my marriage, and it doesn't end because of its failure. There's a quote circulating from your speech that night. Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. Did you know it would resonate the way it has? I wrote that speech weeks before I knew Jason would be there, Danielle admitted. It wasn't about him specifically, though I understand why people connected those dots. It was about something I've learned over years of doing this work. The most meaningful things we build are the things we build for their own sake, not for recognition. And yet you're receiving more recognition now than ever. Which is ironic, isn't it? Danielle smiled. But I'm grateful for the platform. Not because it proves something to my ex-husband. I stopped needing his validation a long time ago, but because it amplifies the work. Every interview I do, I talk about the initiatives I care about. Every headline brings more attention to causes that deserve it. Maya leaned back, studying Danielle with obvious admiration. If you could say one thing to people who are struggling with feeling unseen or undervalued in their own relationships, what would it be? Danielle didn't hesitate. When you've worked for everything you've become, when you've built yourself from sweat and sacrifice and late nights and refusals to quit, no one can take that away from you. No betrayal, no ego, no lie. They can leave. They can diminish. They can choose someone else. But they cannot unmake what you've made of yourself. You are the sum of your choices, your integrity, your work. And that belongs to you alone. The quote went viral within hours of the podcast's release. Tattooed on arms. Cross-stitched on pillows. Quoted in graduation speeches. Printed on merchandise. But more importantly, it became a North Star for thousands of people trapped in relationships that made them smaller rather than larger. Danielle didn't watch the numbers climb. She was already focused forward. The invitation arrived on official letterhead, United Nations Office of Global Affairs. They wanted her to speak at the upcoming Global Summit on Sustainable Development. A keynote address. 45 minutes. An audience of world leaders, policymakers, and changemakers. Danielle accepted without hesitation. The morning she left for Geneva, she packed light, one suitcase, her laptop, documents for the speech she'd already begun drafting. The hotel suite was clean, impersonal, temporary. Nothing in it belonged to her except the view she'd studied each morning, the city that had witnessed her transformation from wife to woman unbound. At the airport, she moved through security with practiced efficiency. No assistant. No entourage. Just Danielle and her carry-on and the future unfolding ahead of her with infinite possibility. She boarded the flight as the sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the world in gold. In the window seat, watching the city shrink beneath her, Danielle Monroe felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly. Not victory. Freedom. The freedom of someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to be magnificent. The freedom of someone who'd realized she'd never needed validation from a man who couldn't recognize value when it shared his bed. The freedom of a woman who'd finally, irrevocably, chosen herself. The plane climbed through clouds into endless sky. And Danielle Monroe, alone, strong, unstoppable, rose with it. 6 months later, Jason Whitaker stood in the cramped conference room of a startup incubator in a part of the city he'd never had reason to visit before. The space smelled of stale coffee and desperate ambition, the particular scent of people still climbing the ladder he'd recently fallen from. The networking event was called Rebuild and Reconnect, a charitable title for what was essentially a gathering of the professionally wounded. Failed entrepreneurs. Consultants between contracts. People whose LinkedIn profiles were carefully worded essays in crisis management. Jason fit right in. He'd aged in ways that transcended the mere passing of months. His hair had grayed at the temples, Not with distinguished silver but with the dull pewter of stress. Lines had carved themselves around his mouth and eyes. Not laugh lines, but the kind etched by sleepless nights and mirrors avoided. His suit, while still well-tailored, hung differently on a frame that had lost weight not from discipline but from appetite surrendered to anxiety. He held a paper cup of wine that tasted like regret and scanned the room with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to anticipate recognition and the discomfort that followed. The event was small. Maybe 40 people. The kind of gathering he would have dismissed as beneath him a year ago. Now he was grateful just to be invited. Grateful that someone still saw him as having potential value, even if that value had depreciated considerably. He'd spent the last 6 months in a kind of professional purgatory. The severance package from his firm had been generous. Hush money, really, to avoid additional scandal. But money without purpose was just numbers in an account, depleting slowly as he paid for a penthouse that felt like a tomb and a lawyer who specialized in discretionary separations. Danielle had filed for divorce 3 weeks after the gala. The papers had been delivered by courier, professional and impersonal. She wanted nothing from him, no prolonged battle, no public statements, no division of assets beyond what was legally required. She'd built her life separately from his for so long that untangling them was simply a matter of paperwork. He'd signed without contest. What else could he do? "Excuse me." A voice interrupted his thoughts. Jason turned to find a young man in his late 20s, eager-eyed and underdressed for the occasion in a way that suggested he was either very confident or very new to professional networking. Probably both. "Yes. I'm sorry, I don't mean to intrude, but—" The young man hesitated, as though weighing whether to proceed. "Are you Jason Whitaker?" Jason's stomach tightened. Here it was. The moment he both anticipated and dreaded at every event, every coffee shop, every public space where someone might recognize him not for his accomplishments but for his failure. "I am." His voice came out steadier than he felt. The young man's face lit with recognition that quickly morphed into something more complex. Curiosity mixed with caution, interest tempered by judgment. "I thought so. You're the guy from the Monroe Gala, right? That whole thing went so viral." He didn't say it cruelly, just matter-of-factly, the way one might reference a historical event or a news story everyone had discussed and then forgotten. Jason nodded slowly. "That's me. Man." The young entrepreneur shook his head, a gesture that could have meant anything. "That must have been intense." It was. Jason waited for the inevitable follow-up, the judgment disguised as curiosity, the schadenfreude wrapped in sympathy. But instead, the young man said, "Danielle Monroe is incredible, though. Total game changer. I heard her speak at the UN last month. My company got live stream access. The stuff she's doing with sustainable healthcare infrastructure? Revolutionary. She's literally reshaping how we think about global wellness policy." Jason said nothing. What could he say? "I mean, she's basically become the face of ethical leadership in our generation," the young man continued, oblivious to or ignoring Jason's silence. "My sister quotes her all the time. There's this thing she said about integrity." "I know the quote." Jason's voice was quiet. "Right. Of course." The young man finally registered Jason's discomfort. An awkward pause stretched between them. "Well, I just wanted to say I recognized you. Good luck with everything." He wandered away, leaving Jason standing alone with his paper cup and the weight of being that guy from the Monroe Gala, defined not by anything he'd accomplished, but by everything he'd destroyed. Jason stayed another 20 minutes out of obligation, then slipped out when the guest speaker began a presentation on rebranding after setbacks. The evening had cooled. October had surrendered to early November, and the city air carried the metallic bite of approaching winter. Jason pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the parking garage where he'd left his car. downgraded now from the Tesla to something more modest, more appropriate for someone rebuilding. He'd made it half a block when he saw it. The billboard stretched 3 stories high on the side of a building, impossible to miss, illuminated against the darkening sky. Danielle's face, 20 feet tall. Professional photography that captured her in profile. Her expression thoughtful and commanding. The image was from a recent magazine cover. He recognized it because he'd seen it everywhere. Grocery stores. Airports. Waiting rooms. The text beside her face read, Danielle Monroe, leading the conversation on global change. Below, in smaller letters, keynote speaker, UN ambassador, best-selling author. The Monroe Initiative, Building Better Futures. Jason stopped walking, stood on the sidewalk staring up at the woman who'd once shared his last name, his bed, his life. The woman he'd been ashamed of. The woman he'd tried to hide. She looked radiant, unstoppable, like someone who'd been compressed by pressure and emerged as diamond. Her eyes in the photograph gazed toward some distant horizon. Forward, always forward. Not looking back. Not looking down. Certainly not looking for him. The billboard was an advertisement for her upcoming speaking tour. Dates listed in cities across 6 continents. Venues that held thousands. Tickets already sold out. Jason stood there for what might have been seconds or hours. The city moved around him. Pedestrians flowing past, cars honking, the world continuing its indifferent rotation. None of it touched him. He existed in a bubble of his own irrelevance. A group of young women walked by, one of them pointing up at the billboard. Oh my God, I have tickets to see her in March. I've been waiting months. She's literally my hero. Did you read her book? 3 times. I want to be like her when I grow up. They passed Jason without a glance, their conversation fading into the ambient noise of the city. He looked up one last time at Danielle's face, this woman who'd built herself from nothing, survived his diminishment, and emerged as something he could never be. Genuinely influential, authentically respected, completely self-made. The billboard didn't mock him. It didn't need to. It simply existed, a monument to everything he'd had and failed to value. Jason lowered his head, drew a breath, and walked away. Not defeated, though he'd certainly lost. Not destroyed, though he'd certainly been broken. Just irrelevant. A footnote in someone else's success story. A cautionary tale told at networking events and in podcast interviews about what happens when ego eclipses integrity. Somewhere above the Atlantic Ocean, Danielle Monroe was probably on another flight to another speaking engagement. Another opportunity to change the world in ways both large and small. She was writing, speaking, building, rising. And she never once looked back. Not at the penthouse they'd shared. Not at the marriage that had suffocated her potential. Not at the man who'd been so threatened by her light that he'd tried to extinguish it. She'd walked onto that stage 6 months ago and kept walking. Forward, upward, outward, into a future she'd built with her own hands, her own vision, her own unshakable integrity. Jason Whitaker walked toward his car in the anonymous darkness, his footsteps echoing in the empty parking structure. And Danielle Monroe ascended into legend. The story ended not with confrontation or revenge, but with the simple, devastating truth that some people rise while others fade, and sometimes the greatest punishment isn't destruction. It's being forgotten entirely. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.